Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the topic of how the pandemic is affecting work and workers and workplaces. I'm Jim Barron. I'm a member of the organizational behavior faculty here at Yale School of Management. And it's my privilege to be the moderator for this afternoon's panel. I very much hope that this finds you and your loved ones as well as is possible under these extraordinary and trying circumstances. And I'm looking forward to a really lively session this afternoon. I'm told that we have something like 200 folks with us, which is really wonderful. I want to welcome the various constituencies who are here, our current students. It's great to have you with us. I understand there's some prospective students, so we're pleased to have you involved with the Yale SOM community. Our loyal alumni are represented, as are our dedicated staff, and so great to have you with us. And then finally, I want to give a special shout out to our colleagues at the Broad Center in Los Angeles, who I understand are taking part this afternoon. It's great to have you with us, and I just want to convey to you the intense excitement that exists at SOM around our partnership. I'm honored to be able to introduce three dear friends and colleagues who are uniquely qualified, I think, to give us a lot of insight into how this pandemic is affecting the world of work. Let me briefly introduce each of them. First, Amy Wisniewski, who is the Michael H. Jordan Professor of Management here at the Yale School of Management. She's a leading scholar in the areas of jobs, careers, work, including virtual work and gig work. And she also focuses on the meaning that people derive from the work that they do and how they do it. Second is Marissa King, who is a professor of organizational behavior here at Yale School of Management. She's an expert on groups and teams, on social networks and social relationships at work, and how our social relations at work affect workers and health outcomes. I'll give her a brief plug. She has a new book coming out in June with a great title called Social Chemistry: Decoding the Patterns of Human Connection. So hopefully we'll sell some books for you, Marissa. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Jeff Sonnenfeld, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Leadership Studies and the Lester Crown Professor in the Practice of Management. He's widely recognized as one of the go-to gurus on topics relating to leadership and the functioning of business organizations. So thanks to all three of you for being here. To get us going, I'm just going to ask each of you to take a couple of minutes and just share your broad perspective on the topic of this panel, kind of what's on your mind as you think about the way that current events are shaping the world of work. Amy, can I toss it to you first?
Sure. Thanks for that. And hi, everybody. Welcome. We're looking forward to this time with you. There are many things on my mind from the point of view of how this is influencing the world of work, but I thought I would focus on just a couple of things. So first, it's striking and it's hard to underestimate how much the changes that have happened over the past month or so has affected the structure that organizes many people's lives, period, but especially around their work. And so with so many people now working remotely who hadn't expected to work that way, I'm going to focus on that. This has, I think, brought to the fore just how much either the work tasks and processes they're a part of depend on human contact in real life, or how much they themselves as people, in order to sustain their motivation, focus, and so on, rely on being able to be with their colleagues, their clients, the people that they are teaching, working with in any number of capacities. So this, I feel like this time has been a live case study for which aspects of your work really do truly rely on human connection. And some of that is about the work itself, and I think some of that is about you. I think that the reason this is challenging for so many reasons is because work structures our days and our routines. In research that's been done on unemployment, obviously unemployment is devastating for many reasons, but one of the less recognized impacts that it has is work sort of organizes people's daily lives in a way that is hard to see until it goes away. And I think part of what I'm hearing from many of my colleagues and our former students that they're dealing with has to do with these kinds of challenges. Around working remotely, I would just say when people work remotely, we know from lots of research that they like the flexibility a great deal, but they struggle with sustaining a sense of connection to the organization and to their colleagues. And so I think we're starting to see the ways in which people are struggling with holding that sense of connection. And we know that when people are in that situation, they try often quite hard to signal their efforts to connect with the people they're working with. And what I've found in work that I've done with colleagues of mine is where this breaks down is not in people's desire to be connected with their colleagues, but with a sense of, do they feel like that's being reciprocated? Do they feel like they're being sort of remembered or looped in or involved sort of in the processes of work? All of this is different now because everybody's remote. But what I would say is, at least one of the impacts of that, and then I'll stop, is that for managers who have been used to working on site, they might be uniquely unaware of the extent to which it might make a lot of sense to be connecting with and reaching out to, not just in Zoom calls or WebExes with their work groups, but individually to the people that they're working with to help them help the employees sustain a sense of connection to the organization.
Great, thanks, Amy. So Marissa, I want to toss it to you, and on a related theme, you've talked about the loneliness epidemic at work. What is this doing to that epidemic, and what potential antidotes do you see?
Yeah, I think that the way that we're staying connected is really different right now, and that perhaps more than ever, in some ways we are connected, as Amy mentioned, through video calls and other mechanisms with colleagues. But this is a moment in some ways of profound social isolation, but I think it's also an opportunity for connection. And I think that that's particularly true in searching for employment. And one of the things I've really been thinking about is, given the high rates of unemployment now, what can be done? And part of that, I think, comes down to this turning back to our networks or social connection. We know that no matter what the time is, that most people find their jobs through their personal networks. And one of the things that we know actually from research is that in times of uncertainty, our networks do something called turtle in. So our cognitive perceptions of how many people we can turn to, how many people we can rely on, really make us think that our support networks are much smaller during times of uncertainty and crisis. And if you think about translating that into a job search, what that means is that now more than ever, actually, we need to be reaching out, if you're looking for a job in particular, and trying to leverage the networks that you do have. And one of the things that we know works quite well for job search and innovation in general is actually reaching out to what are called dormant ties, the people you may not have talked to for 2 or 3 years. Those relationships actually maintain quite a lot of trust, and oftentimes they can feel quite awkward under normal circumstances to reach out to someone you may not have spoken with, even just to say hello. But I think one of the things that's been amazing about what has happened lately is I've heard so many stories of people reconnecting with high school friends, having online college reunions, and people who normally don't have the time and space to come together. And I think that even though this is a moment of, in some ways, profound isolation and loneliness, it's also been an extraordinary moment for people to come together. I think that's helpful in terms of personal and emotional support. It's helpful from working home alone, and it also can be helpful in job search.
Thanks, Marissa. Jeff, what's on your mind as you think about the world of work and the effects of this pandemic?
Well, many things are on my mind, like as we heard from our prior two colleagues. But I just want to say first, Jim, that I'm just so honored to be on this distinguished panel, but to have such a great following on a Friday afternoon, second semester, second year for an awful lot of people that are in a 2-year program, at least of the second years, that this is hopefully a terminal program as a terminal degree. But even for the first years that are with us with no course credit or anything, it's wonderful. Then for prospective students, for new customers, we have to especially do a good job, and we're thrilled to have those folks with us. But I also want to say that what's on my mind more than anything else, and I don't mean this to be pandering, is I don't want to be too obvious how much I'm copying down already from what you, Jim, and Amy and Marissa have to say, is that I can't think of a set of colleagues that have more relevant insight into the catastrophic situation we're going through in terms of its workplace implications. None of us here are here, although we have opinions, to talk about how to open up the economy and in what pace and how to handle the spread of pandemics, but and the consequences on families and individuals. But when it comes to the workplace, you couldn't do better than the panelists, Jim, that we have that I have ahead of me on this panel. Of course, anybody would want to hear the Michael Jordan of anything. We once had a CEO summit where we had John Madonna, who was the head of the predecessor to KPMG, and the Michael Jordan, who, as you know, had been the CEO of CBS and Westinghouse and things. But we said, we have Madonna and Michael Jordan at our event, and we had a packed house that time. They were a little disappointed, but nobody's disappointed. We hear from this Michael Jordan professor. And Amy, what you have to say about work and meaning is always in rarefied air, but never more important now as we understand the centrality, good or bad, of work in our lives and what meaning it brings to us. And already, and I'm not kidding, I could read to you a couple of things I've already stolen from you from what you've said about this notion, and it fits so hand in glove into this notion of meaning as you opened the door. I don't know, Jim, how you sequenced them so perfectly, but certainly wasn't alphabetical, to go directly from Amy then into Marissa for how that meaning ties into as you open the door to connect in this. And Marissa, you're absolutely right. And Jim, you remember your old colleague, Mark Granovetter, on that the strength of weak ties work in how these secondary relationships are so important. Granovetter has a very accessible book out that, until Marissa's is available for a couple more days, if you order it, it's Getting a Job, actually, is talking about how these secondary, really tertiary relationships are so important. But when we understand the fracture of physical connectedness and how we're webbed together in such different ways, again, I can't wait to hear more about what our fellow panelists have to say about this topic, because there's nowhere better to go. My own comment on this, as you know, I take a long look at the role of leaders and their constituents, and that's also been very disruptive. It's a really different relationship. If you think of an orchestra conductor when they versus, say, a violinist or a trumpeter, they can go off when they leave the group. They can still play their instrument in quartets or in bands, pickup bands. But if your instrument is the organization, step away. There's this abyss of insignificance that many leaders have. And as I watch what they're doing in the last 5 weeks, as they aren't traveling as much, and we realize how much of almost a managerial macho there was to the excessiveness of the travel. How many of these CEOs, last week in my class, we had the CEO of McKinsey and Deloitte, but these are people who are traveling close to 200 days a year, so they're 2/3 of the year they were traveling, and their businesses didn't shut down when they're not traveling, but they're learning new ways to stay connected to their constituencies in such far-flung seaports. And the way we used to wonder, how do the Rothschilds keep up with all their different holdings or the Barings and things by using carrier pigeons and things? We're finding there are different ways that they're using. Some are good and some are not. We might call their viral messaging. There was a rush initially, and then I'll stop, a pathology that some used that I'm sure you noticed, which was too much messaging, saying a lot of obvious trite stuff. And many of the things were not obvious and trite. Some of them were just wrong. How many times you hear people saying, "This too shall pass," like Scarlett O'Hara telling us tomorrow and going with the wind, tomorrow's another day. Or Panglossian wisdom, if you remember from Candide, of a lot of nonsense that sounds sensible as they say it, and you realize how trite it is. They don't know. They're just deciding who should travel from which countries to which other countries. Turned out to be wrong, and they were taking a look at how their colleagues were putting out false information, and not because they're running for political office, as we suspect in the White House, or at least some of us suspect, but because business leaders often are constructivists. They see an optimistic side of things. I used to run Amy and I used to teach. I used to teach in Amy Shadows here on a career course at the evil Harvard for many years behind enemy lines. I was teaching a career course. I used to have them write this really long personal paper. And these Harvard MBAs, and I think it'll be true of our own, would write about these awful, tragic events that happened as a Peace Corps worker, a lumber truck that rolled over, and how the kids were killed, and how they had to face the parents afterwards that were with them in this truck, and the guilt of the survivor. And they saw something redemptive in this horrible event. Like, I can imagine anything redemptive is that we see that in a time of crisis, a lot of business leaders want to try to find that positive side. It makes them different from many of the rest of us. So that leads them to put out often some misleading information. The ones who've done a really good job are really transparent. They say what they know, what they don't know. They're very accessible. I should stop right now, as we can talk about this later. But there's some rights and wrongs in the viral messaging I'm seeing that's going out in this pandemic. I hope I didn't put people to sleep already.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. A lot of the questions that came in advance, not surprisingly, were about kind of what the permanent implications of this are going to be for work. Are we going to see working from home as a new legitimate form of work, much more so than we have? If so, how should people manage that effectively? And one of the questions also asked that to the extent that working from home becomes more prevalent, are there different implications for women than there are for men? I'd welcome your thoughts on those issues.
I'm happy to kick us off on that. It's a big topic, so I imagine all of us have something to say on the various angles of this. I think in some sense, again, we're living through the test case of just how much, working from home or remotely many kinds of organizations can handle and bear. And one of the things I have to say I'm excited about on that front is that when you look at where the resistance is to working remotely or working flexibly, it's often from managers who feel that there'll be a loss of control if people go off site. Well, now we've been forced to run the test case. And so I think there's a lot of updating perhaps around things that work and where it works and where it doesn't work, right? That's happening for organizations of all kinds. That said, it's hard for me to imagine that it's ideal for many people to be working completely remotely all of the time, just again, based on prior research looking at people's preferences. But I wouldn't be surprised if this increased the appetite that many people have to work more flexibly and spend some of their time working either remotely or from home. And my hope is that the ability to keep things going during this time does a lot to open the eyes of managers about what is possible in making that work, and that perhaps things are humming along perhaps better than they would have anticipated. You raised, Jim, the question of the differential impact on men and women. For me, I think of this as being about a differential impact on parents and caregivers versus non-parents and non-caregivers. And just in my own sort of organizational work over the last few weeks, the thing that has been stunning is how wildly different the experience is of people who are working while also trying to care for, a 5-month-old is qualitatively different from a 5-year-old, is qualitatively different from a 10-year-old, and is a different planet from a 15-year-old. And I think, allowing people to be more aware and sort of sensitive to just how much additional work and focus and time must go into that kind of caretaking work is, again, I hope one of the things that is hard to ignore after this crisis. Obviously, in normal life, when people are working, their kids are often in school, or perhaps they're in a daycare or some sort of caretaking situation. So I realize that right now it's a bit different, but I think it certainly has helped to make the point that someone working from home without any caretaking responsibilities is living in a very different world than someone who does have them.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, are you suggesting that there will be greater sensitivity to work-life balance after this episode is over?
That would be my hope, rather than, the worst case scenario certainly would be, well, okay, you were able to do sort of all of these things while you had, great responsibilities in the home domain. So that then becomes the new bar. I think that would be a tragedy in this, but rather, the ability to open up conversations about how and when doing the work of the organization works for the employees in a way that allows them to contribute at a high level that they're feeling good about and that we now see could potentially work for the organization. My ideal would be that it becomes a source of flexibility that helps workers as opposed to a new set of demands or expectations based on what so many people are heroically pulling off over these past several weeks.
Thanks. Marissa?
Yeah, I think picking up on that theme of work-life balance, that having honest conversations, whether that's now or in the future, about if we are moving in this direction, which I think that people will, about what are the appropriate boundaries between home and work is really important. Because in the current situation, so with virtual work in general, it's very easy for those boundaries to get blurred. And unless people are having frank and honest conversations, I think it turns into a situation where people are working all the time and there is no separation. And so I think that that's the cautionary tale going into this. And I think particularly now, if those conversations aren't being had, to establish clear norms and expectations about how often people are expected to be available and not is going to be really important. And I think that also has pretty big implications for differences in allowing bias to creep in, because we know when there aren't clear expectations or clear understandings about when you're supposed to be available or when you're not, or if there's a drop in communication or silence, which is just part of this medium, that any of those instances are opportunities, if they're not clearly articulated about what's going on, for bias to creep in. And so being honest and frank about expectations and norms and having a clear, shared understanding, I think is going to be important both now and in the future.
Thanks for that. Jeff?
Well, on that, it's interesting. Amy is a career authority, and Marissa, as a networks expert, is you have both taken a different turn on this than when Jim and I began our career, since Jim's so old and I was following in his path. In the early 1980s, Jim, you remember that the progressive thought in the career movement at the time, and it was a nascent field in our general organizational behavior field at the time, was the forward-thinking scholars were trying to embrace a work-life spillover as a positive. And what you have both articulated is you can be careless with your language and make it seem like that spillover is all-consuming, and we don't have the boundaries. And that was before they did have refrigeration and automobiles and airplanes back then, Jim. But in terms of technology, we didn't have this electronic ball and chain, which has made it very hard to create any kind of barriers or physical barriers of distancing by being remote. Ironically, in class last week, since we're all close friends here intimately discussing this, and hopefully they won't travel too far beyond the 200 plus people that may still be on the line with us, I had Marissa Mayer join in our class discussion. And you may remember, she was the CEO of Yahoo. I think she did a very good job by the end, and she didn't really have it quite figured out by the end, but plenty of guys would have gotten the lead time. It usually takes about 2 years to learn a new job. But anyhow, she ran out of time on the clock. But one of the things she did right up front, even though she delivered a baby soon into the new job, she wasn't a big believer in maternity leaves, which people were kind of shocked and horrified about. But she also didn't believe in remote work, and she canceled what she thought was shore leave. Usually it's the captain of the ship who announces the shore leave, and it's the first mate, like the provost of a university, that has to do the bad news and cancel the shore leaves. And here the CEO, the captain, didn't mind doing it herself. And there are a lot of people who were angry, not only women, but a lot of people were angry, thinking this was a betrayal of her mission. And we kind of pushed her a little bit on, and I think she was acknowledging that maybe you can do a lot remotely. We didn't realize we could, and understanding how to build communities the way you're both talking about it. But we still didn't get to that downside in that whole class discussion, which I'm so happy you raised. I kind of wished you were in the class so we could have talked about this topic. We could spend the rest of the afternoon actually on what you've just raised, is how do you set those boundaries? How do you set those limits? There is a positive side, of course, to all this. And as Amy, you opened up by talking I think it was Amy who you were just talking about how the absence of work, what we know about the consequences for people who not only the sense of loss of meaning and income, but the work, say, of our colleague Peter Schott and Lorenzo Caliandro, but really Peter's work and some MIT colleagues as well, taking a look at job loss, and some of it had to do with trade issues where we lost work because of entry into World Trade Organization and things, what that did to US companies. And they're looking at depression, suicides, and awful catastrophic outcomes. And that work is being cited, politically motivated work right now, and trying to open up the economy faster. But the other side of it is, on this work-life issue, is that we are seeing people appreciating their families, though, in ways. And what that's leading to is, in fact, Harlan Krumholtz, one of our colleagues in the medical school, has a piece that was out in the New York Times last week, or he was actually kind of bothered about what this means, is a 60% drop in cardiacs is being reported. Unbelievable. And strokes as well, and other stress-related things. And of course, as everybody on this call would imagine, a tremendous drop in terms of catastrophic critical care over car accidents, traffic issues with so much less traffic and commuting and things, is that in fact, people are sleeping longer, they're exercising more, although some of us are eating a few too many carbs. I'm trying not to load in while you're watching here. But basically, we're somewhat happier, healthier lifestyle, especially people who are fortunate to not be living alone. That's a whole nother issue. But yeah, so I think it's a complicated area, and I really salute whoever asked us this question, that we really could spend the day on this topic alone.
At my advanced age that you've pointed to, I'm not sure that I can hold this together, but let me soldier on. One of the questions that was submitted in advance had to do with the potential career opportunities that may be occurring as a result of this pandemic. Are there roles or organizations or industries that are going to create opportunities for those people who've been displaced as a result of these developments?
Same sequence.
I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about with respect to this question is, we know historically that after, whether it was the long recession or the Great Depression, that those have been moments of radical innovation, right? So this creative destruction that's happening right now, I think, is going to give rise to innovation as it has in the past, right? Whether that's the incandescent light bulb or the steam engine. But I think that there's a question or opportunity right now to reflect on what do we really want as a society. And so we're in a moment right now where we have in some ways an opportunity to pause. And I think that pause, and whether that's in transportation or consumption, creates the opportunity to begin to think about what do we as a society really want. And that what we've seen historically is that these moments, as hard as they are right now, actually are fertile ground for dramatic change. So I think we're certainly going to see something different. And I think it's up to us as a society to figure out what we want to be different.
Other thoughts on that?
Well, not to be too gimmicky, but on a Friday afternoon, starting with, say, Friday, there are some F's that come to mind. I think the fashion industry is going through quite a change. We had Stuart Weitzman, the shoe designer, in class yesterday, and he went into extra innings. I couldn't believe that people were riveted as we went way late. He was quite interesting. But to me, it seemed like such an anachronism, so much of what he was talking about in terms of design issues. As you know, he's a great shoe designer. We got in the whole area of fashion and stuff. And I hope everybody's wearing slacks or whatever right now, but we don't really know it. Right there is that we are realizing that people have gotten so much more casual in their attire. And I just can't believe that the world of fashion will have the same meaning as we've gotten so comfortable in our jeans and sweatsuits or whatever. But also another F in the world of food. I think we also have discovered that we actually have, many of us, equipment in our kitchen, and you can do stuff with it and make your own. So I do think that a lot of people will be eating out a lot less, which is caused great distress on not just the large restaurant chains, but all these wonderful, small, creative restaurateurs that may, at least for a significant period of time, find that our eating patterns have changed that way. I'd be really sad if that's the case, but I'd be shocked if it isn't. And then I also think in the fun business and entertainment, travel and leisure, and the film industry, that these are irrevocably changed. I have a friend of mine who's the CEO of AMC Theaters, the world's largest theater chain. They're shut down. I don't know if they're going to make it, and who's going to want now to go back out and have the supposed experience of sitting cheek and jowl with others. Or they would argue there's lots of space in their theaters now for more comfortable home-like seating. Well, why not just stay home, watch Netflix, which I'm not invested in. I wish I was, and others. And sadly, this guy's other investments are in the Philadelphia 76ers, a sports league, and in a major cruise line, Norwegian Cruise Lines. I don't call that a lot of diversification, because these are all, the public experience is going to be careers that go into those public spaces irrevocably changed. I worry about that. But there's one good news piece that comes out of all this, and I bet the panel will agree. It started, for whatever reason, in Italy. I think it's 7 p.m. And now we see it in New York every night. And that is the genuine heroes in society that we have sometimes remembered to celebrate: public safety workers, police and fire safety workers and rescue workers, that they are out there at hospitals every now in New York as well with these tremendous, you've seen the videos of these nightly public salutes and the public cheering them. Is that we're recognizing that the heroes are something different than some of the people that I study so much of, the CEOs and leaders, but who the heroes are in everyday society, that we're seeing healthcare workers being celebrated as priceless treasures in society, recognizing how much of the personal peril they're taking on each night, but delivery drivers and clerks in grocery stores, and an appreciation and recognition of the careers and centrality of people that aren't necessarily climbing up a hierarchy the way the Trump administration might want to celebrate them, but all these other people out there that make our communities function. I think that those careers are becoming a lot more virtuous and celebrated at long last.
Thanks. Amy, your thoughts about where there might be opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to do the politician thing and dodge that specific part of the question because I wanted to connect to something that Marissa said in her comments, and it connects to Jeff as well with respect to the workers that are getting so much of our focus. So, a lot of my earlier comments, assumed essentially, people who are working in office jobs who are now transitioned to doing those from home. But I think one of the things that all of this has done has been to shine a light on who is considered an essential worker, meaning they must head in, they must be there, that society doesn't function without them, that the healthcare efforts happening in the face of this won't function without them. And, I do think, the applause and the signs and, sending food are all wonderful things. And I think from an opportunity perspective, I see a real opportunity in what this has laid bare from the point of view of rethinking how is it that we want these essential services structured? How should we be treating and rewarding and creating a safety net around the people who do this kind of work, so that the kinds of stories that we're seeing sort of currently about how difficult so much of this has become is something that we can prevent in the future, knowing that this kind of thing is likely to happen again. And so, the same kind of response of feeling very excited about these kinds of work occupations also happened after 9/11, where in fact many people left more sort of traditional jobs to go into teaching, to go into the armed forces, to go into join police forces and firefighting forces after that crisis. This one's a bit different because it's coming with a giant recession that is of unknown depth and duration. But I do think that, I hope it has a longer lived effect on the kinds of policies that we might support and ways in which we might think about structuring the support of the people who do this kind of work.
So you've touched directly on one of the questions that was submitted during the course of the panel, which is frontline healthcare workers, including many lower paid workers, are facing stresses far different from those of people working from home. How do you think this experience will affect these workers and methods of managing, coordinating, and compensating them?
we have so many haunting images of bus drivers pleading with people on videos, being coughed on and then passed away. It didn't have to be there. And people who are cleaning up the debris of other human beings in hospitals that don't have to be there. They were trying to get to work yesterday in Michigan, stuck in traffic jams because politicians encouraged them to block the highways in protesting Michigan's governor, because she's kept the state safely locked down for the time being, and the ripple effect on others and the stress that this was causing people who already have enough stress in their lives. I think that what Amy's talking about, there is just so much more empathy now for those folks, but will there be the resources that go to support them other than that we have our hearts and prayers? Enough of that. Can we actually show that we pay them better and treat them better? That I think there'll be a good political uprising, I think, to support these folks a lot better.
Marissa, it looked like you had some thoughts.
Yeah, it's along those same lines. Most of my research is in healthcare, and I've had the opportunity to speak with people being on the front lines quite a bit recently. And everything that I'm hearing, I'm very concerned that if there's that sort of morale aren't going to get them through this. And that I'm very concerned that there's going to be a mass exodus from nurses, techs, MAs, unless they start getting paid better and supported better. And we've already seen through this crisis that our healthcare system is not equipped to deal with this kind of crisis. And having a massive exodus in employment is going to exacerbate the system's ability to continue to deliver healthcare. And so I think that words, goodwill, encouragement, compassion go a long, long way. But at the end of the day, that if people aren't able to feed families and also get childcare at the same time to be able to show up at the hospital, the system's not going to function.
Right.
Amy, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to underscore what Marissa said, that, Marissa and I, together with other colleagues, have been involved in some research efforts, as well as sort of contact with people working in healthcare during this time. And, one of the things that we've been hearing, which I think is quite powerful, is, thanks for the applause, but where's the PPE? I'd rather the society's sort of appreciation of us, be shown by actually keeping us safe, as opposed to having people feel like they are working in a quandary where they can either, take care of the people who are so ill, or try to keep themselves from contracting this virus. And so I hope that the question that we will all be confronted with as a society, is not one that we soon forget. It may be impossible to soon forget it, depending on how long this lasts, but that it informs ways of restructuring things that have been revealed to be quite lacking at this time.
Say this is a great time for SOM to showcase its mission, not for commercial reasons, but in fact for the societal engagement that the school claimed that we stood for from our origins. And we're seeing it happen spontaneously, and things like in the faculty, as Amy and Marissa are taking a look at what they're studying in terms of Frontlines. But we have quite a number of students out there working as volunteers in a lot of settings, some of them risky settings and some of them in remote support. We have 20 students that are working with a group called Advanced CT. It's through the governor's office. It's a great Yale alum, but working really hard as volunteers, matching up philanthropic organizations around this state in distress, have to find donors, and they've rallied together some very wealthy donors, but they've put together panels to get funds to them quickly to help, especially the food needy right now, which has become an enormously growing population. And so many of the helpers there, like my kids and kids of many people in the line, that are not allowed to go out there because they could be carriers. So that we don't know, they're asymptomatic, but they can't be there working in the kitchens and things, is how we're covering for that. We're seeing a lot of SOM people working hard on that front. So I'm really proud of the role the school is playing. And of course, our distinguished Ingenuity is out there working very quietly right now, but with the 5 governors, she's basically not sleeping right now. As a non-scientist, she's getting virologists and epidemiologists and critical care experts and others to work with CEOs to try to figure out how a great model can be set in the Northeast collaboratively. And it's I'm just so proud of what Yale SOM is doing on this front to put our efforts behind our historic message.
Several of you have talked about the crisis and its impact on frontline workers and the lack of resources and the lack of appreciation and compensation. And that kind of connects to a question that several people have asked, both prior to the panel and while we've been online here. And that is, how is this crisis likely to affect unions and unionization? Are we going to see a resurgence of unionization in response to the kind of insecurity that this pandemic has wrought on so many people?
I'm happy to give an impression of this, and I again want to just stress that this is not an area of expertise for me, but in thinking about it, I think that there are a couple of forces that have to be kept in mind. So I think a force that would absolutely move us toward being more likely to see more unionization would have to do with just how much frustration there is about the level of protection that was in place for employees in a variety of industries and occupations. At the very same time, the ability to organize an effort like that depends upon people's ability to, this goes to Marissa's work, to be connected with each other, right? So that they can mobilize those efforts and come to realize that what I believe is the same thing as what you believe, and she believes, and he believes, so that we can begin to marshal an effort to come together to try to push for those reforms. And so though the will may be there, one of the things I worry about is, sort of structurally speaking, the ability for people to interact and to hold forums and discussions and sort of realize and take the take the read of their colleagues to know what it is that they have the will to back and to put real effort into, might be more difficult under these conditions. And so for me, it's a hard question to answer because I can see those forces pushing in opposite directions.
Marissa or Jeff, do you have any?
Big change on this front is that part of the demise of organized labor has been in part because of their success, that they had such great triumphs in terms of bringing about reforms in the quality of work that a lot of places felt they weren't needed anymore. It's sort of like the firefighters during the Great Depression that were supposedly starting fires to prove they were still needed out there. I don't see any unions creating trouble to make themselves look like they're more necessary. But in that absence, we have seen that when we launched our careers, it was just less than a quarter of the workforce was represented by organized labor, and now it's less than 10%. And if you look at the private sector, it's half of that. It's between 5 to 6% at most, and quite a bit higher in the public sector. I think we're going to see stronger voices in the public sector jobs, but not in the private, I don't think, throughout of this. And that's not to say we don't have problems there, but it's not going to be easy to organize who's suffering. Right now, we've seen these small business administration funds depleted in the last 24 hours of this enormous $2 trillion stimulus package. And a lot of the big recipients are not being revealed. 20% of it, a little bit more than 20%, went to the state of Texas alone. There's a lot of politics behind who got what. There's a suspicion that hedge funds applied for this, and somehow that they were justified, and a lot of small business people that don't have the resources, don't have the ability to organize as a union front, as business owners and as managers. They wouldn't be protected under labor laws, and yet they're disadvantaged in getting their fair share. So I think there's going to be a lot of strength of have and have-nots. I think where Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or others launching their campaign in the next month, I think they'd have a much stronger following. I'm not, endorsing them. I'm very happy, just to say it on the record, that I like Joe Biden a lot. But I think there's going to be a great groundswell of anger, of haves and have-nots out there, and the organized labor capacity to represent who's not getting a fair shake right now, because a lot of them are small business people.
Marissa? No thoughts on that? Well, kind of related to this last point, I mean, to what extent is this pandemic going to exacerbate existing social inequalities?
We have a sociologist, Mauricio. Jen, you can answer this too. This is one of your areas of expertise.
I mean, I think on the health front, right, we are already seeing that it's quite clear that communities without resources and people of color are being disproportionately impacted by the disease itself. I don't know the numbers, and someone else might be able to speak to this, but if I had to guess, my guess is that unemployment has also hit those communities harder. And so this is a moment again of choice where we're going to have to decide as a society, are we going to, how we're going to respond to this. But I think it's very, very clear that people without resources are getting hit much, much harder than people with resources across the board.
I completely agree with that. And I would add that this ties to the union answer that, you know, as Jeff was responding to that, I started thinking about the fact that, you know, given how much employment itself has become sort of more atomized, I would say, over the last several years, the opportunity to even convene a union effort has changed considerably. And so that, I think, in conjunction with what Marissa is talking about, which is to say how much this is laying bare the societal inequality that we're seeing around you know, health status, you know, educational opportunities, the kinds of organizational or work situations people are in. I wonder if instead of raising the question about, you know, unions connected to work, if it's going to raise much more sort of fundamentally, how is it as a country and as a society we want to structure things like healthcare, education, you know, how much, given this atomization, can these things be lodged into work arrangements versus it needs to be taken outside of that?
I think the focus on giving voice to the voiceless, power to the powerless, and equity, as you raised it, Jim, are really critical. And it's been the focus of most of our panel. And even I began at the top of the hour by being critical of the viral messaging of CEOs coming off as somewhat platitudinous at times. I do want to mention there's a great sensitivity of a new cadre, a new cohort of CEOs that's quite inspiring. As we take a look at the survey data coming in right now over the last few weeks, Edelman's Trust Barometer, it's showing you know, plunging public trust in public officials, especially federal level. Governors are looking pretty good. At the federal level, other than Dr. Anthony Fauci, not a lot of support at the federal level in trust. But CEOs, and my employer is rising. It's been very trusted. The messaging, despite the pathologies that I said some were putting out there to watch out for, and some disappointment, mass layoffs from Macy's to Marriott, places that have always talked about how, you know, how central people are to our culture, and then we're seeing them sacrifice so quickly. An awful lot of places like Walmart and others are taking a different path and trying to dramatically improve workforce management practices, doing a lot of hiring, but also showing a lot more sensitivity to workforce stability. Unexpected places like, you know, Morgan Stanley or others that haven't always been perfect, ideal employers, that we're seeing a lot of change and a lot of candor in messaging. The president yesterday read out a list of 200 companies that happened to be members of the Business Roundtable and outright said that they were supporting his economic rollout plans. Many of them came forward and said, no, we never said that. We never signed on. And here are our differences out there. And I think that really matters, that, you know, these aren't necessarily financiers, but these are CEOs of more Main Street rather than Wall Street. And and they're not the usual voices, not Warren Buffett or whatever. It's a different cadre. We're hearing from maybe different generation. I'm enthusiastic and hopeful as we're seeing that voice of the new CEO.
But do you think that some of these new initiatives that companies are taking that are, you know, more focused on the welfare of their workers are likely to be sticky, or are we likely to see a retrenchment once this pandemic is passed?
Well, I think the companies that have the resources, it will stick. I think companies that have this existential threat about them, it's going to be hard for them to stand by what have been their printed mission statements that people really believed in, and then they've retreated, and we've lost the workforce of, you know, of a great place like Marriott or or struggling retailers. Obviously, retail is going to be very hard for them to live by the physical promise of retail anymore, and that's a shame what the workforce implications will be.
Amy and Marissa, you have thoughts on this? A couple of interesting questions that have come up in the Q&A box. One of them is, what's the long-term impact of this on business travel? Are we going to come to view business travel as an outdated sort of practice because we're going to be more facile in being able to establish connection through virtual technology? Amy, you teach about virtual teams.
I do, together with Marissa in the core, a global virtual teams course that all of our MBAs take in the midpoint of their first year. Who would have known just how relevant this content would be just a few months later? On the question of business travel, I would not be surprised if we saw a long-term decline in the amount of travel that people are doing to carry out their work. Obviously where it's non-essential, for a couple of reasons. I think first, this crisis is going to severely strain many organizations over a long period of time, so the appetite on that side might be lower than we might anticipate. And second, for the travelers themselves, I think there are a couple of forces that will make it more likely to find creative ways to get the work done without going there. One is how much more sensitive we're all going to be to just, what kind of petri dish you're traveling in when you fly from point A to point B. And, it's hard to ignore just how much in the scientific coverage of this pandemic, how much attention's been paid to the fact that this will become something that happens again, right? And so there may be less appetite on that side. And then finally, though there are challenges for people who are suddenly, relegated to working from home and everything that we've talked about earlier that goes with that, it may be the case that people are just less willing to sort of take off and be, not as much a part of their community life or family life or whatever that might look like for them. That appetite, I think, may go down as well. Maybe I have too much faith in people's level of delight versus frustration and the opportunity to spend time at home. But I do wonder if that might make the more discretionary, it really could have been a meeting kind of thing drop off in the coming years.
I do have to say, I think that I have never in my life actually wanted to be in the same room with my colleagues as much as I have been over the past few days. I think, and actually there's something about this moment also that helps us remember just the importance of being in the same room and the physicality of social connection. And so I think certainly actually we'll see reductions due to cost, due to preferences, due to health concerns, hopefully due to environmental concerns. But at the end of the day, as much as I love teaching GPT, I also think that there's no substitute for human connection and being in the same room with someone. And so my guess is that there are other people who probably feel like I do, and there's a certain sense of longing for actually togetherness. And so I think that that may be one force that's working counter to a lot of other forces that are going to decrease travel.
I still completely agree, and I'm really glad to hear both of you say that, given your expertise in the pedagogy as well as your mastery of the technology of distance learning. As you know, I've been a modest skeptic over the years, and have found I have to not just eat my carbs here, but also eat my words when this Zoom technology, if you don't mind the privacy issues, works a lot better than I ever imagined. So we're keeping continuity going. And I don't know if, Jim, you really wanted to bridge into education learning per se from that, but what I do think we miss out on is that the proximity matters. I used to argue that a differentiating quality from schools that all of us on this panel have worked in before versus SOM is that at many of those other schools, when you're not teaching or required to be there for some particular meeting, people are back home in somewhere in their suburban villas or whatever, is that here at Yale and SOM, and it's at Yale in general, but especially at SOM, if they're in town, it's very likely we're in the building, in our offices, with the doors open. So it isn't just hallways with tumbleweed blowing down, as we've seen at other schools, as there's a sense of community, so that both as colleagues, how we interact, but also in the classroom, there's so much of the nuances of meta language, of learning, body language, of forming coalitions, of serendipitous conversations in the hallway that didn't happen in the grandstanding of class, and things you just can't imitate through this technology. I think we're making the technology work, and the students have been such good sports, so much better than I ever imagined. And every now and then I sometimes hit the right buttons. But one of the things I want to say before we close out here, Jim, is that as we take a look at essential workers and we talk about technology, I'm sure it's on everybody's mind, and it maybe doesn't need to be said, it's just so obvious. But when it comes to thinking of who are essential workers and the class structure that seems to form around that, at the risk of making a lot of enemies, it's not the tenured faculty. The essential workers in this system are the people that are behind the scenes making this happen right now today. I think it's Abraham who helped line this up, and Ken Wheeler's whole team of, Donnie and Enoch and Froy and Jessica and Rob and everybody that in physical peril, many of these people are in the buildings through this whole week, making sure the infrastructure works, and they've been working around the clock in really stressful situations, and I'm sure we'll somehow make it up to them. But I don't know if the rest of the panel agrees, because we have so many great people, in Emily and Alice and others who helped line this up today. But really, the SOMIT are just in a league of their own in terms of what they've done for us to make this semester close out well.
Yeah, you stole my thunder.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean,
Say it better.
I certainly have come to realize how essential the IT folks are to being able to have some even remote chance of discharging my responsibilities, through this technology. And so I think, many people are coming to appreciate that occupation and industry as being much more essential than we ever thought before. We've hit the 4 o'clock hour. There's lots more stuff that I wish we had time to talk about. Some really provocative questions that we didn't have time to get to. Thank you for those questions. I want to thank the 3 panelists for meeting the high expectations that I had of all 3 of you. I think you've given us a lot to think about. And I want to thank all of the folks who joined us, the over 200 folks who dialed in, and hope you found this to be stimulating and productive use of your time. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.